Alright, so this is part two of, let me make sure this is recording, yeah. Part two of interviewing Grok 3 on the practice of Damnatio Memoriae by the ancient Romans, or at least Imperial Rome. And so we completed one output, and then I respond with the question, then could the practice of Damnatio Memoriae have suppressed, erased, blurred, and vandalized the history of the Emperor Nero's conversion to Judaism instead of reworking the narrative of his final days instead reworking the narrative of his final days in order to vilify him in other ways before the Roman public? The idea that Damnatio Memoriae could have suppressed or erased a narrative about Emperor Nero converting to Judaism is an intriguing hypothesis, but it hinges on a mix of speculation and historical analysis. Let's break it down based on what we know about Nero, his reign, and the practice itself. Nero and Judaism. Any evidence? There's no solid historical evidence from primary sources like Tacitus, Suetonius, or Cassius Dio. So it doesn't even consider the Talmud a primary source in the question of whether Nero converted to Judaism. That's a little queer, don't you think? So there's no solid historical evidence from primary sources like these Roman historians that Nero converted to Judaism. Now, again, Tacitus, the part about Nero's alleged suicide and the disposition of his remains is missing from the annals. So he's out, even though he's the only one who was living when these events allegedly happened. Suetonius was born a year after Nero's alleged suicide, and Cassius Dio is like in the next century, so he's not even in close proximity to these events. So the one source we have, Suetonius, wasn't contemporaneous to these events. He didn't it's doubtful he was even a twinkle in his daddy's eye when Nero is alleged to have committed suicide. So these primary sources are kind of weak when it comes to Nero, the received narrative of Nero's final moments. But then here we see the bias that not even the Talmud can be considered a primary source for Nero's alleged conversion to Judaism. These Roman historians who wrote shortly after his death depict him as a figure of excess cruelty and instability, who wrote shortly after his death. Well, Tacitus, again, didn't write about his alleged death and the disposition of his remains, according to Grok 3. Suetonius did, but again, he wasn't alive at the time, and Cassius Dio was probably just repeating what Suetonius said. So, let's see, none mention a religious shift toward Judaism. Instead, they focus on his theatricality, the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, that's 4 years before his alleged suicide, and his persecution of Christians, whom Romans often confused with Jews due to their shared origins, except that they didn't really have shared origins. That's the Christian narrative. Christianity was cooked up by the Romans as a counterfeit or consolation form of Judaism, or a more universalist form of Judaism that was Gentile friendly and aligned with Gentile values rather than Jewish ones. If Christianity had been so similar to Judaism, there wouldn't have been any need for it. You know, they try to paint the picture that the whole reason that Judaism and Christianity supposedly sharing the same roots, that the whole need for Christianity to become a separate religion was because the Jews didn't receive Jesus as the Messiah, when the reality is that Judaism was just fine as a religion and was already messianic in its beliefs. And then the Romans came along and started working their Psy War, and we even have it documented in Flavius Josephus that Josephus tells Vespasian that he is the fulfillment of a messianic prophecy. So they managed to put that off on a Jewish POW, that whole spin, when really it's a Roman spin that any Roman could be the eschatological Messiah. And it's also in question whether the Jews at that time were expecting an eschatological Messiah. Maybe they were just expecting a king to bring back autonomy to the Jewish people, and he would have been seen as a king who would live and die like any of the others had, but because of Hebrew terminology, he would have been referred to as Messiah, Mashiach, because kings in Israel were referred to as Mashiach, and so were high priests in Israel. And of course there was one non-Jew, Cyrus the Great of Persia, who was referred to as Mashiach by the prophet Isaiah. But that was because Cyrus liberated the Jewish people from the Babylonian captivity, and not only that, gave them leave to and also supported the rebuilding of the temple. So Cyrus was far more the Jewish Messiah, or the expected Jewish Messiah, not that he was Jewish, than was Jesus. Jesus actually accomplishes things that are contrary to the requirements of the expected Messiah, like the destruction of the temple. You'd say, well, Jesus didn't destroy the temple. Nobody predicted it, didn't he, in the Christian scriptures? And the reason he could predict it was because Jesus is just a literary disguise for Titus Flavius, who did destroy the temple. So, having done the fulfillment of his backdated retroactive prophecy, that's how the prophecy could come to pass. He could predict what he already did. All he needed to do was backdate the prophecy about 40 years, almost, like 37. So, maybe some of this confusion between Christians and Jews stems from the fact that Christians didn't exist before 70 AD. So then when you have Christianity rising as a state cult under the Roman Flavians, And you have Nero blaming somebody according to the Roman Flavian sponsored histories of the Great Fire in Rome. Well, then they would have Nero being a Julio Claudian enemy of the Roman Flavian dynasty would have to be pictured as opposed to the hero religion under the Roman Flavians, which would have been Christianity. And that's if Nero ever blamed anybody for the fire of Rome. Like if Jews had actually set fire to Rome, then there would have been some difficulty, I think, reconciling him blaming the Great Fire of Rome on the Jews when he eventually committed or converted to Judaism. So, I guess we could spend some effort investigating the details of the Great Fire of Rome, but as an event that happened 4 years previous, and knowing that the Roman Flavian sponsored histories against Nero probably aren't even telling the truth, that's not a use of my time that I want to engage in right now, because this assertion that Nero converted to Judaism doesn't really rise or fall on the Great Fire of Rome, as far as I can see. And I'm not omnipresent. I'm not like a what is this AI agent called, Manus? Maybe I could get Manus to research all these different things at the same time, but how long would that take for it, really? It would probably take less than an hour. And then I would have all this output that I would have to sift through that would take me a lot more than it took for it to peruse all of the sources, to scan all the sources. So what I'm investigating is a fairly focused line of investigation. So because I'm focused specifically on Nero's final moments and how that either aligns with or contradicts either the Jewish narrative on Nero's final moments or the Roman narrative on Nero's final moments. Now, the Roman narrative on Nero's final moments, I certainly don't have to work too much to support that narrative, because obviously there have been a whole army of scholars who have done that already. So I'm specifically working on investigating what support there is for the Jewish narrative on Nero's final moments. The closest Nero gets to Judaism in the record is his marriage to Poppaea Sabina, who some sources, like Josephus, suggest may have been a Jewish sympathizer, but even that's debated and doesn't imply Nero's conversion. Except that men tend to be less interested in religion than women, and usually men go along with whatever their wife is going to do when it comes to religion, right? Because you're trying to keep your wife happy. That's just how it goes. Look, and I can just say that from my experience as a missionary. I've seen it plenty. And I've moved within different denominations and splinter groups, and And you see it happening over and over. Usually it's not the man who's leading the couple in any kind of religious pursuits. It's usually the woman. And, you know, we can go back to the archetypes of Adam and Eve, Eve offering the apple and Adam not wanting to lose his wife, so he, goes ahead and eats the apple. That's just how it is, man. We don't have in the Roman historians an explicit report of Nero's conversion to Judaism. That is true. But the fact that Poppaea seemed to be favorably disposed to learning about Judaism from Flavius Josephus, as reported in Flavius Josephus, then I think that actually supports the possibility of Nero's conversion. But the more concrete evidence provided by Flavius Josephus is that he reports that Nero reigned for 13 years and 8 days. Separate those two. 13 years in quotes and 8 days in quotes, right? Not the string of words 13 years and 8 days, but 13 years as one element, 8 days as the other element. Now both of those elements are found together in the same chapter only in Genesis 17, the chapter of the Torah on the Abrahamic covenant and the ritual of bris or circumcision. So Flavius Josephus is telling us that Nero was circumcised. Why was he circumcised? As I joked, not to become an Egyptian. He was circumcised to become a Jew. All the literature from the first century ties circumcision in with the Jewish people. And there was apparently even, I think there was a law enacted later against circumcision by the Romans. And I think that there were other efforts made by what was that guy's name? There was one foreign ruler who came, I think it's surrounding the Maccabees, one foreign ruler who tried to outlaw circumcision amongst the Jewish people. So obviously there's some tension surrounding performing any kind of cutting on the male foreskin amongst Gentiles. Amongst Jews, it happens when the boy's 8 days old, so it's a matter of history. But for Gentiles who want to convert, then that's a little bit of an issue for the men. The women don't have to be like circumcised or receive female genital mutilation. As far as I know, apparently that's something that goes on in Islam. Who the hell knows why? I mean, why any heterosexual man would want to mutilate a woman's vagina is beyond me. I can't even conceive of the thing. Anyway, I don't want to get into slang, but yeah, that practice doesn't make any sense to me. And some say it's an oppressive thing where they're trying to deny them experiencing any pleasure from sexual relations to lessen their potential, I guess, for infidelity by chasing sexual experiences with other men, I guess. But I mean, some of the, like the Taliban was even wanting to forbid women from speaking to each other recently. And that's just, I don't see how a woman could even endure. Uh, I think that would be extremely psychologically damaging to a woman to deny her the ability to speak to other women. You know, that's, women seem to, at least most women, seem to thrive on socializing with other women. Probably more to the extent than men thrive on socializing with other men. A man can go out into the woods and sit on a mountainside and enjoy the view and the breeze and the sounds of nature and be at peace. But it seems like women derive a lot of their peace from socializing with other women. And you could say, "Oh, that's such a sexist perspective." This is just these are my observations from, almost 60 years of life. So say what you will, but this is what I've observed. I'm not saying these things to be malicious. On the contrary, I'm saying that women shouldn't be suppressed or oppressed and prevented from being able to communicate with other women because it could be severely psychologically damaging to them. And I would say the same obviously goes for female genital mutilation. Is it can make sexual relations painful rather than pleasurable. So I don't know why you would want to do that. It just, like, what human even conceived of that? Probably a man who regarded his women as livestock. There certainly wasn't a whole lot of empathy when that idea was thought up. If Nero had converted, it would have been a massive scandal in Rome. Yeah, exactly, which is why it could have resulted in him being declared a public enemy, why it could have resulted in the practice of Damnatio Memoriae, which could have resulted in his history being altered in a way that was more seen as more pleasing for or beneficial for the public. Yeah, exactly. It would have been a massive scandal. It would have been a massive scandal in Rome, where emperors were expected to uphold traditional Roman religion and their own divinity. Yeah, that's a good point. So if you're I hadn't even considered that one. It's like if the Roman emperor is the state god, then if your god stepped down to say that he wasn't a god, and then to promote the worship of another god, the deity of the Bible, then, I mean, that would I would think that would result in some turmoil in the empire, in Rome especially. Such an act could have been framed as treasonous, aligning with the kind of behavior that triggered Damnatio Memoriae. But the absence of this narrative in surviving texts suggests either it never happened, or it was so thoroughly erased that no trace remains, a tough claim to prove without evidence. So thoroughly erased that no trace remains except in the Babylonian Talmud and in Flavius Josephus. So again, like Grok 3, which is based on the scholarly consensus, is siding with the scholarly consensus. It's not asking the important questions. And furthermore, it's assassinating the Jewish voice and perspective, which is pretty much par for the course as far as I can see from the Gentile establishment ever since the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. If we were to compare this to Matthew chapter 7, the Torah and the prophets, which would be the Jewish voice, is the narrow path, the narrow way, the narrow road. And few there be that find it, right? Whereas the Gentile perspective is the broad road. You know, that's you couldn't really ask for a more fitting description between Orthodox Judaism versus everything else in the world, every other ideology in the world, which is Gentile. One is a very narrow road, narrow path, narrow gate. Few people enter in through that gate, but the Gentile way is this wide road, gates of Sheol, if you will, gates of Shaul, Sheol. There's that Hebrew wordplay. Whereas Sheol and even Saul or Shaul seem to be metaphors, I guess, for, or I don't know, code words, poetic expressions for the diaspora, the land of the world that is not biblical Israel, the dispersion, the scattering, the exile, the gullus, the galut, and for a child of Israel, the diaspora is, it's in fact, I'm not sure if it was Saul the gravedigger in the Mishnah. It might have been him who said that the diaspora is one vast unmarked graveyard. So whereas a Jew is not supposed to walk over a grave because it would render him ritually unclean, they're saying that in the diaspora, the Gentiles are not so strict in marking their graves. That's even if they bury someone properly. So that wherever you walk, you can be walking over an unmarked grave. So you're walking around in a perpetual state of ritual uncleanness and not yeah. So it's just the diaspora is not really where the children of Israel or the Jewish people are supposed to live, ideally. for so many reasons, not just because of that, but because doing a commandment of the Torah is seen as an opportunity, a merit. It's not seen in the Gentile way as a burden. And so if someone offers the opportunity to do one of the commandments of the Torah, you jump at it. Whereas in the Gentile perspective, if someone wants you to do a commandment, oh, but it's such a burden, I just can't do it. But make sure that you obey the laws of the land and that you pay the tax to the emperor. None of the laws of the land aren't a burden. Paying the tax to the emperor isn't a burden, but it's Jewish law that is a burden. And, for a Gentile, I can admit that there is some difficulty when you're not raised in Judaism, you're not living in a Jewish community. There is some difficulty in doing the commandments of the Torah. And some of that just may stem from the fact that you weren't raised Jewish. But for a Jewish person, that's their culture. That's their lifestyle. That it would be as difficult for a Jew raised in Torah observance to observe a commandment of the Torah as it would for a Christian to put tinsel on their Christmas tree. There's no difficulty there. When it's your own religion, it'd be like a Hawaiian person experiencing difficulty making a dish out of poi, or even like something out of pork, I would imagine. It's I don't want to say it's second nature, it's like first nature for that person to do those things. So for some literature to come along and say, oh, doing the commandments of the law of the Torah is just, it's a burden, it's too difficult, no man can do them. That's a Gentile talking. That's how you can know that literature is coming from a Gentile source. Because you can go through the whole Hebrew Tanakh and you're not going to find any of the prophets telling the people that doing the commandments of the Torah is burdensome and too difficult. It just isn't found there. Sometimes the obvious just comes along and smacks me in the head, and it's because of my own preconceptions and biases that I don't see how obvious the obvious is. Damnatio Memoriae's role. After Nero's suicide in 68 CE, the Senate declared him a public enemy, hostis, and his memory was condemned. So here it says that it was after his suicide that he was declared a public enemy. So if that's correct, then not even the declaration of him as a public enemy would have been the reason for him to flee Rome to the villa and to execute himself. And I think somewhere down the line here we come across the fact that Grok 3 seems to admit that, okay, it wasn't because of Damnatio Memoriae, and it wasn't because of him being declared a public enemy. It was just because of the political turmoil and his power amongst the people diminishing, but especially probably with the military and with the Senate. Um, so his statues were toppled, his name scratched from inscriptions, and some of his laws nullified. Okay, so if Nero converted to Judaism and his statues were toppled, his name was scratched from inscriptions, some of his laws were nullified, and then surely his history was tarnished, then here we have the method by which the his conversion to Judaism could have been obscured from the Roman people and the Roman historians. But it appears that despite this, Jews having their own network of intelligence, that they had this alternative narrative on Nero's final moments, at least his final moments as a Gentile. This fits the pattern of Damnatio Memoriae, erasing honor and rewriting legacy. If Nero had converted to Judaism, this process could have easily targeted that aspect of his life, destroying records, defacing images tied to Jewish symbols, or reworking narratives to emphasize other vilifying traits like tyranny or arson. Well, there you go. It's basically admitting that all the bad things reported about Nero could have been because of the practice of Damnatio Memoriae. Now, as far as images tied to Jewish symbols, I don't know that Nero would have been like that immersed in Jewish culture at that time to have even been producing anything like that, you know, like just because you convert, that doesn't necessarily mean that you immediately own all of this imagery that, you know, a person that's lived their entire lives as a Jew might feel comfortable employing. Now, you will get some people who are in the process of converting to Judaism who will quickly don Jewish clothing and Jewish, like maybe like a Star of David necklace or like a high necklace, I think is another one you'll see Jews wearing sometimes. That doesn't mean either of those existed back then. But what I'm saying is, and you also get like so-called Jewish Christians or so-called Messianic Jews, many of whom are just Gentiles dressing up as Jews who are eager to put on, say, the trappings of Judaism in order to legitimize the Christian myth in the eyes of Jewish people, right? So there's a sensitivity about putting on, we'll just call it Jew face, you know, if you haven't done the time, if you haven't put in the time in boots, as they would say in the army, right? Like if you haven't earned it, how quickly are you going to take upon yourself any Jewish imagery? So, let's see. So I don't think that, like I mean, it's possible there could have been images of Nero with Jewish symbols, but I kind of doubt it unless Maybe they could have been minted coins, but it would have been Nero as a convert to Judaism, so probably under a new Hebrew name. The practice was flexible enough to blur specific details. For example, statues were sometimes recarved into likenesses of successors, like Vespasian, and inscriptions were altered to omit his name. If a Jewish conversion existed, Romans could have suppressed it by focusing on more palatable crimes, like blaming him for the fire or his theatrical obsessions, to avoid elevating a foreign religion's influence. Exactly. Thank you. This would align with Roman disdain for Eastern practices, making it politically expedient to erase that thread and amplify others. Thank you, Grok 3. Reworking the narrative. The surviving accounts of Nero's final days are dramatic, fleeing Rome, abandoned by allies, and killing himself while Now, abandoned by allies, but at the same time, somehow the history of his final moments are being, we are to believe, carried by these allies to eventually the historians who would record them. And killing himself while lamenting, "What an artist dies in me," according to Suetonius in Nero 49. These stories vilify him as weak and self-absorbed, a far cry from a devout convert. If a Judaism narrative existed, Damnatio Memoriae could have shifted focus to these traits, ensuring his legacy was one of disgrace rather than religious defiance. The Great Fire, pinned on him despite shaky evidence, became a cornerstone of his infamy, possibly overshadowing any alternative story. Tacitus, in Annals 15.44, notes the scapegoating of Christians, which might have muddied any Jewish connection into a broader Eastern cult smear. Romans were pragmatic about memory erasure, and if Jews were seen as somehow responsible for the setting on fire of Rome, then that might have been a motive for setting Jerusalem and the temple on fire, as an act of revenge or justice. Romans were pragmatic about memory erasure. It wasn't always total. Nero's name persists in histories, suggesting selective vilification over complete oblivion. A conversion could have been downplayed as rumor or reframed as madness, fitting his erratic image rather than preserved as fact. Except that if you said that he converted, then any reports from the Jewish community of his survival amongst them would have basically flown in the face of the received Roman narrative. Could it have happened? It's possible, but unlikely without some hint in the record. It says in the record, but in the record, they're talking about Roman sources, while they're just not even looking at the Jewish source. And then, of course, the Flavian report in code it's not documented anywhere, so it's not something that Grok 3 could have absorbed. Roman historians loved juicy gossip. Suetonius revels in Nero's scandals, so a conversion might have survived as a smear even post-damnatio. The lack of Jewish sources like Josephus, except that Josephus is a Jewish source of Nero's conversion, claiming Nero as a convert also weakens the case. they'd have had reason to note it. Well, he did. Flavius Josephus did note it. Plus, Nero's actions, like taxing Judea heavily after the fire, don't scream Jewish allegiance. No, but you know what? People change their minds, especially if your wife is hounding you. That said, Damnatio Memoriae could theoretically suppress such a story. The Senate and subsequent Flavians had every motive to vilify Nero to legitimize their rule, and erasing a Jewish phase while amplifying other flaws fits that agenda. The process wasn't perfect. Private records or oral traditions might have leaked, but Rome's oral traditions, yeah, like the Talmud, like Flavius Josephus. But Rome's control over public narrative was strong enough to blur it into oblivion. His conversion, I think they mean. The thing is that Rome, its reach may not have extended to all of the places that were Jewish seats of learning. Because if there was, after the destruction of the temple, Judaism existing in any place in the empire, then it would have been a form of Judaism, we would think, that would be given permission to exist by the empire, or something done in secrecy. But for a fully flourishing Judaism allowed its own self-direction, then that was probably Judaism that was beyond the reach of the empire. Unexpected angle, one twist. Nero's persecution of Christians might have been misremembered or exaggerated to eclipse any Jewish ties. If he'd flirted with Judaism, his later crackdown on a related sect could have been a convenient pivot, except that so-called related sect, if we subscribe to the Caesar's Messiah thesis, it didn't exist back in 64 CE. If he'd flirted with Judaism, his later crackdown on a related sect could have been a convenient pivot, history rewritten to show him as their enemy, not their kin. It's a stretch, but it shows how Damnatio Memoriae could twist motives. Verdict. Could it have happened? Sure, in theory, Damnatio Memoriae was tailor-made to scrub inconvenient truths and replace them with useful lies. But without a shred of evidence for Nero's conversion, we have two so-called shreds of evidence. It's more likely his final day, well, three if you factor in the fact that Rabbi Meir was supposed to have been descended from the Emperor Nero. It's more likely his final days were vilified for political theater, not to hide a religious secret. The practice didn't need to erase Judaism to make him a monster. His own actions, real or invented, gave Rome plenty to work with. So his own actions, real or invented. So if they were invented, then they weren't his own actions. So you're basically saying, like, because Rome lied, that gave Rome everything they needed in order to shame Nero's legacy. But Another form of lying is to just, cover up something and not even mention it. Key points. Research suggests there is no historical evidence that Emperor Nero converted to Judaism, with the only mention being a legendary account. Again, there's that character assassination of legendary. You're just dismissing the credibility of the account in the Talmud just by saying it's legendary. Does the account call itself legendary? I don't think so. I think you're getting that word from a scholarly establishment that is biased against the Jewish voice and perspective, who obviously holds the Roman historians in such high regard. Even the Roman historians weren't either don't have a complete history referring to these events, or they're not contemporaneous to these events. But we think that the Roman historians are so dependable. So, with the only mention being a legendary account in the Talmud, not a factual record. Except the Talmud is explicit about Nero's conversion. It states it matter-of-factly. It seems likely that Damnatio Memoriae, used to erase Nero's memory after his death, would have removed any trace of a conversion if it occurred, but no such evidence exists. Why would evidence exist if any trace had been removed? The evidence leans toward Nero being a proponent of Roman religion, with his wife Poppaea Sabina showing sympathy for Judaism, not Nero himself. Yeah, Nero could have been a proponent of Roman religion up until the point that he stopped being one and converted to Judaism. Nero's religion and conversion claims. There's no solid evidence that Emperor Nero converted to Judaism. Historical records like those from Tacitus and Suetonius depict him as aligned with Roman paganism and the imperial cult, not Judaism. Up until the point that he wasn't, maybe. The only mention of a conversion comes from a Talmudic legend. Talmudic? Those who are racist against Jews, they love that word Talmudic. Because they can just, dismiss anything mentioned in the Talmud. Oh, that's just Talmudic. Even though the Talmud is a pretty large library that will fill up at least a couple shelves on your bookshelf. But let's just dismiss that whole large body of literature by just calling it Talmudic. So it says, which is likely a fictional story, not history. Except that it states that he converted matter-of-factly. So, just the bias here. And it's all because Grok 3 is based on all the many things that have ever been printed by all the many people who are just parroting what they got from the Gentile academic community about this. It's doubtful that any of those scholars would have had the motivation or inclination to question the accepted Roman histories, or to question whether the Jewish perspective might be true. Partly because unaware of Flavius Josephus's report in code about the length of Nero's reign, they would have known of only one place where it was suggested that Nero had converted to Judaism, and that would be the Talmud. So There being only one statement to this fact, or one statement of this claim, we'll call it. They would say, oh, well, we've got 3 historians over here. Really, they've only got 2, and one of them's like in the next century. But they're thinking they've got 3 Roman historians testifying to it. And then we've only got 1 voice over here. So which do we side with? Well, it was probably, the Roman historians are probably more reliable because, one, they're in probably closer geographical proximity to Nero. And why those who are reporting Nero's conversion to Judaism, where they're in this land far away, why they would even be asserting such a thing, it just, to them, it just didn't seem plausible. But obviously, we've found a second witness, if you will, of Nero's conversion to Judaism, and who knows, but there might actually be other witnesses to it that haven't been found yet, simply because no one has been looking for them. Role of Damnatio Memoriae. After Nero's death in 68 CE, the Senate declared him a public enemy, leading to Damnatio Memoriae, which erased his images and records. If he had converted to Judaism, this practice could have suppressed that detail, but given the lack of evidence, it's unlikely there was anything to suppress. Instead, Roman historians... and it could be that there was unlikely anything to suppress, because Nero may have just gone into exile from Rome. So, like, he just wasn't there anymore. Instead, Roman historians focused on vilifying him for other acts like the Great Fire of Rome, possibly to avoid highlighting a religious shift that could complicate their narrative. Unexpected detail. An interesting angle is Nero's wife, Poppaea Sabina, who had sympathies for Judaism and helped Jewish causes. This might explain the Talmudic legend, but it doesn't suggest Nero himself converted. In summary, it's improbable that Damnatio Memoriae suppressed a conversion to Judaism, as no such conversion likely occurred. And Roman records focus on other aspects to tarnish his legacy. Damnatio Memoriae and the potential suppression of Emperor Nero's alleged conversion to Judaism, a comprehensive analysis. This note provides a detailed examination of whether the ancient Roman practice of Damnatio Memoriae could have suppressed, erased, blurred, or vandalized the history of Emperor Nero's alleged conversion to Judaism, instead reworking the narrative of his final days to vilify him in other ways before the Roman public. Drawing from historical records, scholarly interpretations, and relevant sources, this analysis aims to address all facets of the inquiry, ensuring a thorough understanding for readers interested in Roman history and religious dynamics. So this is page 9. Let me see if I can... Okay, so the next so we got 3 more pages. Historical context and Nero's religious profile. Emperor Nero, reigning from 54 to 68 CE, is a figure well documented in Roman historiography, with accounts from Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio portraying him as a proponent of Roman paganism and the imperial cult. These sources highlight his theatricality, persecution of Christians, and involvement in the Great Fire of Rome, but none mention a conversion to Judaism. This absence is significant given the detailed scrutiny Roman historians applied to emperors' lives, especially those subjected to Damnatio Memoriae. The only reference to Nero's conversion to Judaism appears in the Talmud, specifically in Gittin 56a, a legendary account where Nero, upon shooting arrows toward Jerusalem and receiving a prophetic verse from a child, flees and converts to avoid divine retribution. Scholarly consensus, however, views this as a midrashic narrative, not historical fact, intended to convey moral or theological lessons rather than document events. Damnatio Memoriae, definition and application. Damnatio Memoriae, meaning condemnation of memory, was a Roman practice to erase the memory of individuals deemed traitors, typically posthumously through destroying statues, removing names from inscriptions, and nullifying laws. Just a minute. So again, Nero shooting arrows toward Jerusalem. One would assume that Nero, according to this account, was at least within eyeshot of Jerusalem, right? If he was firing arrows towards it. And especially given that he received a prophetic verse from a child, so we assume that that was a Jewish child. So this would have happened in Judea, not in Rome, right? So that places Nero at Jerusalem. Just wanted to point that out. So, Damnatio Memoriae was not a codified law, but a Senate or imperial decree, often applied to hated emperors like Nero, whose memory was damned after his suicide in 68 CE. So I think it's fair to say that the Damnatio Memoriae wasn't specifically because he committed suicide. Unless it was because he ended his Gentile life, committed suicide in that sense, when he began his new Jewish life. This process included defacing images, erasing names, and sometimes reworking statues for successors, reflecting both political and economic considerations. So then, Nero's legacy, his historical, or his history, could have been reworked for the benefit of successors, namely the Roman Flavians. Mind you, the Roman Flavians were either engaged in or had very recently been engaged in a war with the Jews in Galilee and Judea, resulting in the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Examples of Damnatio Memoriae cases and action taken. I think we've already covered this in a previous output. Yeah. This table illustrates the variability in application, with Nero's case involving widespread erasure due to his perceived tyranny and treason. Analysis of potential suppression. Given Nero's Damnatio Memoriae, if he had converted to Judaism, this act, seen as a rejection of Roman religion and potentially treasonous, would likely have been a focal point for erasure. Converting to a foreign religion, especially Judaism, would have been scandalous, aligning with behaviors warranting damnation. However, the absence of any historical mention in Roman sources suggests either no conversion occurred or it was effectively erased, though the latter is speculative without evidence. Now, could you call Flavius Josephus a Roman source? Well, given that his histories, I think, were sponsored by the Roman Flavian dynasty, Flavius Josephus's histories, I think, are kind of a Roman source. At the very least, a hybrid source. Because then, if Flavius Josephus was reporting in code to his Jewish readers that Nero had converted to Judaism, then that suggests that even though Flavius Josephus was sponsored by the Roman Flavians, he may have had divided loyalties and may have been still trying to be of benefit to his own people. But then there's another possibility also, and that is that Flavius Josephus was a historian ghost-written by a Roman Flavian or one of their courtiers, and that the report of Nero's conversion to Judaism was intentionally put in code for the Jewish readers so that they would arrive at that conclusion. But then that suggests that the Jewish community somehow wouldn't know one way or the other whether Nero had converted and gone to Jerusalem. But I mean, that's like a possibility we have to admit that it's possible it was done that way, because the Flavius Josephus, I think, reports that the Roman Flavians had captured a copy of the Torah, and that I think they put it in the Temple of Peace that they erected. So they could have become versed in the Torah to the extent that they might have reported something in code in order to make the report seem more credible to Jewish readers. That's a possibility. The user's suggestion that Romans reworked his narrative to vilify him in other ways, like blaming him for the Great Fire, is plausible. Roman historians writing post-damnation emphasized his excesses and Christian persecutions, possibly to avoid highlighting a religious shift that could complicate their narrative or elevate Judaism's profile. This selective vilification aligns with Damnatio Memoriae's flexibility, where specific aspects could be suppressed while others amplified, though complete erasure was the ideal. Nero's connection to Judaism, Poppaea Sabina's influence. An unexpected detail is Nero's wife, Poppaea Sabina, described as Theosebes or Theosebus, God-fearing by Josephus with sympathies for Judaism. She interceded for Jewish causes such as securing priests' release, which might explain the Talmudic legend's origin. However, this connection does not extend to Nero himself, whose actions, like taxing Judea heavily, contradict conversion. Except that taxation of Judea would have been before his conversion, so it doesn't rule out the possibility that he had a change of mind. Also, if Poppaea had converted, then I think it's very probable that it would have been pressed upon the mind of Nero that in order to maintain a harmonious household, he might need to convert himself. Feasibility of suppression. The effectiveness of Damnatio Memoriae varied. While it aimed for total erasure, private records, oral traditions, and incomplete implementation, for example, reworking statutes, meant some memories persisted. If Nero converted, suppression would require removing all references, but given Roman historians' focus on his other crimes, it's unlikely they hid a conversion. Except that, the historians, it may not have even been in their interest to report his conversion. Or it could have been hidden from these historians. Like, for example, we're missing the portion of the Annals that covers Nero's final moments. So the fact that it's missing, that might have actually been because the report of his conversion was concealed. Whereas Suetonius, the primary source out of the three, he wasn't even alive during these events. And then Cassius Dio is from the next century, so he's no big deal in my opinion. Instead, they likely ignored it, focusing on more politically expedient vilifications like arson or tyranny to maintain Roman religious superiority. Conclusion: research suggests no historical evidence supports Nero's conversion to Judaism, with the Talmudic legend being a fictional narrative. It seems likely that Damnatio Memoriae, applied after his death, would have erased any such conversion if it occurred, but the evidence leans towards no conversion happening, given Roman record silence. Well, part of the reason for the Roman record silence is because you've got scant Roman historical records about the matter. The practice's flexibility might have allowed suppressing specific details, but without evidence, it's improbable it suppressed a non-existent event. Except, like I've pointed out, we do have more evidence than what Grok 3 is aware of. Poppaea Sabina's Jewish sympathies offer an unexpected angle, explaining the legend, but not supporting Nero's conversion. So then I fire another prompt at them. So we'll stop here though. So this has been part 2 of Grok 3 on Damnatio Memoriae. And yeah, so we'll look for more.